Sarah Elks is a senior journalist with The Australian, and in October 2025, she was called on to cover one of those stories that comes up from time to time in newsrooms. A tragic death, this one a long way away from The Australian's Brisbane bureau. Sarah, how did you first hear about the Lizard Island cruise death?
I heard from a source early one morning that a passenger of a cruise ship in far north Queensland on the Great Barrier Reef was missing. We understood initially, I thought it was another situation like the Lonegans, the American couple who had been left behind while they were scuba diving on the Great Barrier Reef in the 1990s, which was a horrific case. We soon realised that it was not quite like that. What had happened was that a luxury cruise ship had actually left a passenger behind on remote Lizard Island, which is an incredibly beautiful island in a remote area of the Great Barrier Reef, and they had left behind one of their passengers, who we later discovered was 80-year-old Sydney woman Suzanne Rees. And they hadn't realised that they had left her behind after a day trip, shockingly. It was only after she didn't turn up for dinner on the ship that we understand fellow passengers raised the alarm. And the ship initially thought she may have fallen overboard. They did a search. They searched the ship. They searched the waters immediately surrounding. And then they put in a call to the Australian Maritime Safety Authority's 24/7 hotline for these kinds of marine incidents, and they headed back. They turned the ship around, and they headed back towards Lizard Island. They immediately started a search that night. The cruise ship is obviously a pretty slow vessel. They sent some crew members ahead on a smaller boat so they could start searching by torchlight for Suzanne Rees, and they didn't find her, unfortunately. Police ended up finding her on the Sunday morning. They found her body about 50 metres off the path that she had been walking on a guided hike.
So let's go back in time a couple of days, Sarah. Friday, October 24 was when this vessel left the port of Cairns, setting out on what would have been a once-in-a-lifetime journey. Suzanne Rees, we now know, was an 80-year-old lady from Sydney, a very adventurous person. She looks extremely fit. She looks wonderfully happy and healthy. There's a great photograph of her having what looks like a champagne breakfast. And she lived with her daughter in Sydney. She was obviously a well-loved and extremely capable, although elderly lady. So the vessel left Cairns and their first stop was Lizard Island. What were they doing at Lizard Island?
So the Coral Adventurer had a number of options for their passengers when they docked at Lizard Island. If people wanted to get off the ship and explore, they could do some snorkeling in the water off Lizard Island. It's incredibly beautiful. They could also take a guided walk with crew members up to Cook's Look and then back down again. And we know from Lizard Island Resort what they tell their hotel guests, a very exclusive, luxurious resort. They say go very early in the morning, take a lot of water, and take communications devices, because even though it is only a 4-kilometre round trip, it can take a number of hours, and there is no cover. There's no tree cover. It's very exposed. And it wasn't quite summer yet. It was late October when this happened, but it was extremely hot. And even though Ms. Rees was extremely fit, as you've said, she was a keen bushwalker. She was a member of a bushwalking club, and her family says she was very fit and healthy. What they understand, what they've been told, is that at some point on her walk, she said to the crew members that she wasn't feeling well. And what her family has been told extraordinarily is that she was instructed by those crew members to find her own way back to the ship. Now, what we have discovered is once we reported those details, a lot of the Australians' readers are keen cruisers, and they have said how unusual it is for a passenger let alone an elderly passenger, to be expected to navigate their way back somewhere, particularly when they're already not feeling well. So I think the family and others have a lot of questions about the appropriateness of that decision. And obviously, in hindsight, we can tell it was the wrong decision. What should have happened was a head count of all passengers. So ships are supposed to have very strict, for obvious reasons, very strict protocols to count on and off people who leave the ship. And it's particularly strict when people are in the water because of the Lonergan experience. However, it seems as if either the protocols weren't followed or they certainly weren't followed properly, because they've not realised that Suzanne Rees was not on the ship until several hours after they left Lizard Island.
Yeah, let's just pause and put ourselves in our imagination on that walk with the two guides from the cruise ship who were taking a group of people up. I can imagine, and I have some empathy for them. They might be young people, typically, who work in cruising. They're leading a group up. Somebody in the group says, I'm not feeling well, I might head back down. Don't worry about me, I'll be fine. Perhaps that's one way that it could have unfolded. I can sort of understand how they might have felt. Well, we have the other people that we need to look after. There needs to be two of us to take them all the way up to the top. So you can understand that scenario unfolding. It does bring to mind for me, Sarah, the death of Michael Mosley, the greatly beloved British doctor who died on a Greek island. Again, set out for a walk, a fit older man in his late 60s, and died very, very close to help after apparently becoming disoriented and losing his way. It's a nightmarish scenario for those young cruise workers, isn't it?
Of course. And we don't want to presuppose or prejudge any of what individuals may have done. I think what a coronial investigation may discover is what systems were in place and what systems failed. And I think those are the big questions, is how can systems be changed or tightened or followed more precisely to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again. We, of course, don't want to unfairly place blame on any particular individual before all the facts are known. But yes, it does sort of beg a belief. And perhaps it is something worth noting that the passengers, there was about 112 of them on board. They were supposed to leave a week earlier, so there was some kind of electrical problem with the ship. They all had to wait on the ship for a week in Cairns. So it wasn't the ideal start to the trip, but presumably they may have got to know people, and maybe that's why some of Ms. Rees's fellow passengers noticed that she wasn't at dinner on that night after the Lizard Island walk.
The ship that Suzanne Rees was on was called Coral Adventurer. That's owned by a company which is ultimately owned by NRMA, the big tourism and motoring conglomerate that's one of Australia's biggest and most significant companies. How did you rate their response to your queries, Sarah, and to the family of Suzanne Rees?
I think, unfortunately, they weren't very forthcoming. I think they went into full crisis mode, as you can understand. And certainly initially, they weren't willing to say very much on the record at all, including to help us report as accurately and as fairly as possible. As time went on, they were a little bit more forthcoming. I think certainly as Ms. Rees's family quite courageously released some really detailed statements to us, to the Australian in particular, running through exactly what happened. And also Catherine Rees has spoken about her disappointment about the contact that she received from the Coral Expeditions Company and NRMA, she felt like then that there were a number of unanswered questions. And she was also quite critical of the company, saying publicly that they had offered her and her family help and support. But she said at the time that it was not clear what help and support they were offering. And I think what they wanted at the time were some clear answers to exactly what happened. And we have reached back out to, and hopefully by the time this comes out, we might know more, but we've reached back out to the family of Suzanne Rees to see whether they have received some answers to those outstanding questions. And we will be talking to all of the different agencies that were investigating. So after the death, the police initially responded with searching. The police were the agency that managed to find Ms. Rees's body on the Sunday morning. There was a coronial investigation launched, an investigation by the Australian Maritime Safety Authority and a Workplace Health and Safety Queensland investigation. We've not heard anything yet about the outcomes of those investigations, but I think it'll be really important once we do know what their recommendations are, that they are adopted so that this kind of tragedy doesn't happen again.
It's a really interesting balance that Australia faces, isn't it, Sarah? We're so protected by great consumer laws and by great safety regulations a lot of the time. We're also ageing well. We're often very healthy into our 70s and 80s, and we're adventurous. We like to travel. All those things come together, and I think maybe it's easy for operators to forget that maybe some of their customers are quite vulnerable, elderly, vulnerable people who are almost more like children, who need the protection of operators rather than just being left to their own devices. How have you kind of reflected on all of that in the months since you did this reporting?
I think that's such a difficult question because there might be a gap between what each of us believes we're capable of and what it actually turns out we're capable of. And perhaps what each of the passengers needed to be told was just how tricky this kind of hike is, and about the conditions, about how hot it is, to make sure that the largely older cohort is properly supported with, maybe extra water and some food on the journey, and perhaps you need a couple of extra crew members. And, it does show that, as you say, our older Australians are really keen to experience our beautiful country. If these companies are going to sell them a very expensive ticket, then I think the very least that a passenger could expect is that their safety is protected as much as possible.